Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar. I am Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a great panel discussion today about DevSecOps, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will be able to access it later on via an on-demand link that we'll be sending out in an email post-event. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time you have a question during our presentation today, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And we will try to take as many as we can near the end of today's discussion. Okay, with that, we will kick off today's webinar, which is DevSecOps Challenges in a Cloud-Native World, a panel discussion. We have some great panelists today, very, very knowledgeable in the space. We have Colin Dominy, who's a DevOps consultant with Veracode, and Shri Itsan, who is product manager at WhiteSource. Vikram Kapoor, who is CTO and co-founder of Lacework, and Ben Newton, who's Director of Product Marketing at Sumo Logic. Welcome to all of you today. Thank you so much for taking the time and being on this panel discussion.
Thanks for having us on.
Great, great. Well, I know we have a lot of stuff that we need to cover. Want to go ahead and just let the audience know that today's conversation is actually going to be based loosely on an ebook called The State of DevSecOps, which we have just published on Security Boulevard. And it's also going to be available via download on Security Boulevard, and everybody who registered for today's webinar will be sent a link post-event that you can just download the ebook on your own whenever you feel like it. Okay, let's go ahead and kick off our discussion because we're talking about DevSecOps, which pretty much, unless you've been living under a rock, you know that it's a thing, and it's being discussed on all corners of the DevOps sector these days. And we talk about it extensively on DevOps.com as well as on Security Boulevard, and it's becoming, I wouldn't exactly call it mainstream yet, but certainly a lot more companies are aware of the idea, the ideology, the philosophy behind it, and hopefully are kind of getting their feet wet, at least in the in the space. So I kind of want to start our discussion today with taking a look at what the state of DevSecOps is today. And I know you guys all kind of represent different parts of the market. And so I'm really, really interested in hearing what you guys have to say as far as what you're seeing in the space with your customers when it comes to DevSecOps. And Shri, I thought if you could start us off by just kind of telling me what you guys are seeing, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I have to say that for me, this is a super interesting subject, right? Because as part of my job, I meet a lot of users and a lot of companies that are inside now in this transition to DevSecOps, to DevOps in general, but our expertise is more related to security. And we do see that, of course, application security is, it's a top priority today for companies that are developing software. However, it's still becoming more and more challenging and complex as we see the release frequency continues to rise, and also the requirements for data security are getting stricter, right? So thanks to the new DevOps practices and tools, the development life cycle is getting shorter, and it's allowing organization to actually meet the market demands and also deliver a better customer experience. But then what we actually have to think is whether application security or security in general, does it keep up? And I think that's the main question that drives the DevSecOps idea. And we do see that the application security has undergone a main transition in recent years. And I think DevSecOps is like the next transition. I think a lot of the companies have already achieved DevSecOps, as we call it, but it's definitely a long process. So that's like my view of how we think of DevSecOps today.
All right, great. So Vikram, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing? And one thing I'd also like to kind of hear from you is whether you see it as a growing trend.
We definitely see it as a growing trend, and a lot of our customers at this point do have security people either consulting with DevOps or actually part of the embedded team where the security is part of the DevOps. In some sense, if you kind of think about it, DevOps really runs the cloud environment, and even in a public cloud, for example, they are responsible for doing the storage administration and the network administration in terms of security groups. So security is basically kind of an integrated function of DevOps. And a lot of our customers realize that, and they're kind of trying to put two things together. At the same time, it's kind of hard also because the skill sets and interests are kind of different on both sides. And that's where they find automation or integration in terms of different tools helps them a lot in kind of getting DevOps and security on the same page and be able to talk the same language.
Okay, that makes a whole lot of sense. Colin, over at Veracode, are you guys seeing your customers adopting DevSecOps and of those who are, do you kind of see them kind of all doing it at the same time, or are you seeing kind of different degrees of DevSecOps adoption?
Yes, I think my experience is we see both ends of that spectrum. I mean, I've worked with customers where they're running in fully automated. They're doing, the unicorns. They're doing the dozen or 2 dozen releases a day, and they're running Veracode in that, running, live scans on production code. And then we've got other organizations who are still, battling to get to grips with the basics of just getting, standard hygiene, standard security testing tools into their delivery pipeline. So I'd say it's a very, very mixed bag, from the good to quite frankly the awful.
Okay, great. And Ben, regarding that, we're looking at it sounds like it's, as Colin just said, it's a mixed bag of adoption. Why do you think that it's so uneven at this point?
It's a great question, and even before I answered that, I was listening to this, it reminded me of, when you ask how long this has been around. I remember having a Twitter war, let's call it that, back in I think it was 2011, 2012, about rugged DevOps, and whether that was a thing. And I'll leave my opponent nameless, but it was but we were arguing because it was like, well, DevOps is already rugged. I'm like, no, it's not. There's these things aren't taken seriously. So I think from the very beginning of DevOps, this was kind of lurking beneath the surface, and any of the kind of those DevOps pioneers were already thinking about this. And I think part of the reason why it's spotty is when I think about there's potentially two intersecting trends going on. One is that you are, these DevOps, these teams that are implementing DevOps or, site reliability or, however they're doing it, and they're trying to have this continuous process, as security is becoming a production concern, because what's fundamentally DevOps about is about bringing production concerns back further into the process, back to engineering development, then obviously they're going to bring security concerns back into it, right? So I think that was kind of natural. And so any team that's already on that process is going to be a natural transition for them. But I think the other trend you're seeing is there's a big trend that we see a lot with our customers also, is this about breaking down the silos. There's a real need and desire to break down these, both the data silos, the functional silos, particularly in this case, say between software development, security, and operations. So even when companies aren't necessarily ready to say we're doing DevSecOps, they're clearly pushing in that direction. So I think you see this. I would agree. It's a total mixed bag, but I think it's a good thing, because everybody wants to get to the right place. They're moving the right direction, but they don't necessarily have the tools, the culture in place to fully embrace it. So it's going to be a transition for a long time, I think.
It's interesting that you mentioned rugged DevOps, because that's how we used to term it over on DevOps.com, and I never quite understood why it was rugged. I was was kind of pictured like the brawny man when we talked about rugged DevOps, but anyway, I'm so glad that we're now using DevSecOps because it makes a whole lot more sense to me. So, but one of the things you did kind of bring up was the fact that the companies are now kind of wrapping their brains around it, and I would imagine that culture actually plays a huge role in that. And if we don't have a top-down culture of instilling instilling security earlier in the DevOps software delivery lifecycle, then I imagine it's pretty much all for naught. But so Ben, the question I have for you is, are we talking about, is DevSecOps inserting the security people into the DevOps process, or is it, are they just providing input, or how do companies go about doing that and making it doing it in a way that really embraces security and the DevOps process and not really leaves anybody out in the process?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. And, fundamentally, I was involved in the early DevOps process. I'm a recovering product manager. And when I was going through that in the beginning, the tendency was to talk about the technology. It was always the technology. People arguing about Puppet or Chef. And I think there's a tendency to even do that now with DevSecOps, because that's the safe space. When you have people talking about a problem, it's like, okay, well, let's talk about the technology. The technology will fix it. Well, the reality is what's the biggest thing that's held back DevOps adoption? It's always culture. It's almost always culture. I mean, the technology matters, but you can do the technology all day long. But if you haven't actually adapted your culture, or at least on the road to that, you're going to have a really hard time to adopt it. So I think particularly when you talk about how companies actually get to DevSecOps, I think it has a lot to do about where the culture's at and how they're going to adapt it over time, because fundamentally it's all about that. It's all about the collaborative, very cross-functional collaboration environment that you see within DevOps. And I think in particular, I've had the, honor of like interviewing a few different people about security, and actually talked to a lot of people about, DevSecOps in particular in this case. And the best term that I've heard about this is they talk about guardrails. And I've heard this from a few different people now, so it's not just one person that said it to me. And it was fundamentally, it's like, hey, the security team is typically known as a team of no. It's like they're always the ones saying no.
Right.
And you can't be that way in a collaborative environment. It's not going to work. The collaboration is going to break down. So what's been explained to me is you set up guardrails and you say, okay, I'm not going to tell you exactly what to do. I'm going to tell you that these are the boundaries. Within these boundaries, shoot off, innovate, but you cannot step out through these boundaries. If you step out these boundaries, we got to talk and we got to make sure that it's okay. So, and that has worked in some of these really forward-thinking environments, and I think that's not easy. I don't think that's remotely easy. So I think it's all about providing a sort of relationship where it's not about inserting stops into a very continuous process. It's more about bringing these two cultures together and figuring out a way to provide input without slowing down what really works about DevOps.
Great. Anybody else? I mean, what are you guys hearing from your customers, or what are you seeing from your customers in terms of culture and how that is impacting their DevSecOps journeys?
So I think that we talk about the breaking down of the silos. I think it's security people, security professionals, and I'm putting my hand up as one of those people. Have this? I think they're quite fearful of where DevSecOps is taking them, and how they're going to have to expand and change their skill sets. It's no longer going to be good enough for them to be pumping out PDF reports or spreadsheets. I think AppSec has labored because security folks don't necessarily understand how software developers work. But if you bring in cloud native technologies, if we go on to containers and Kubernetes and whatever else is in the mix, it's even harder for people who are not fully immersed in that environment to even get their understanding of how to start protecting that. And I know I personally feel, sometimes when I look at that landscape and how I think about attacking and solving some of these protection problems, it's hard. and it's a hard problem. So there is a skills gap there that I think security people are going to have to address.
Interesting. So then, when we are talking about the skills, do you think it's more of an issue that, and I'm posing this to anybody who wants to answer, do you think the onus is more on the security people to learn DevOps or software development than it is on the software development folks to learn security, or how does that balance out?
So I think in general, like, I kind of see in a lot of our customers' environments and customer situations, the guardrail kind of takes a lot, and it kind of gets the two sides to be talking to each other. But at the same time, I think fundamentally, it's a skill set that needs to kind of get embraced by DevOps, and that's why it becomes DevSecOps, where it's actually not easy to separate those two functions out. Partly because the way innovation is happening on the DevOps side, where the amount of services that AWS releases or other public cloud releases every year, and the number of APIs they have, every one of them, it actually requires specialized skills to kind of go through them and understand what the attack model is and how should I go about securing it. And at the same time, actual implementation of that security is likely to be in the Terraform scripts or CloudFormation scripts or something which actually DevOps owns. So I think at some point, it's really the culture has to kind of embrace both sides, where somebody needs to have more in-depth knowledge of how to secure something, which is a security person, but at the same time being able to communicate that to the other side and actually get it implemented in a more scalable way and be able to run at the DevOps speed and be able to innovate at that speed. Being a person who has actually been on the both sides of the equation personally, like as a DevOps person and as a security person, they really are two skill sets where the team has to kind of come together and bring the whole thing together at one point.
Okay, great. Shuri, what about you? I'm really interested in finding out from, obviously because White Source, it plays very heavily into the security space, and they also play in DevOps. I mean, is there a lot of bleed over, or I mean, is it really becoming more of a, it's something that maybe companies are they're doing DevSecOps. They're not really considering it two separate buckets anymore.
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing that across the board, both for smaller companies, but also for larger enterprises. So we've recently, last week, been with the management team of a big enterprise, and they actually expressed their feelings about the friction between the security teams and the development teams. And this is something that is quite new to us. We are very used to hearing development teams saying, oh, I have all these security issues that I have to fix. And on the other hand, we're hearing the security people saying, I send everything to the development teams, but they're not doing anything with it. So see the friction. We're starting to see that from a management perspective as well now. So I think this is definitely something that is, in terms of, the cultural change, it needs to come both, top down, but also bottom up, so that everyone can facilitate the change.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Hey, Charlene, one thing I'd add to that, I was looking back at a couple of interviews I did with CISOs recently, and one thing that they said was interesting. Two things is, one is that they are definitely hiring different skill sets into the security teams, is like that they wouldn't have traditionally brought in. Like, they're hiring people with development skill sets and more software engineering or even DevOps skill sets or whatever makes sense, because I think it's partly to make that connection easier. Is they're not just necessarily hiring people that are traditional security professionals. And the other thing that I heard, one of the people I talked to, one of the CISOs I talked to, said that you don't just impose this on the software development team, and in the sense of like intentionally or unintentionally, you have to help them understand why. And I think that's really, having been on the product management side myself, when we would get 30 JIRAs that said, okay, here's all the stuff you have to fix for this particular thing that we're trying to do, it was just like, okay, well, we're going to get through this. But if, once our CISO sit down with me and said, okay, here's what we're trying to accomplish. That's why this stuff matters. Here's where we're trying to go. Then I was part of it. I was actually a participant. So I think a lot of this is all about, I think Vikram was saying, this is all about communication skills too. It's like make them part of the process. You got to build those bridges and you got to explain to them why, not just what.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's also something that you know, we kind of preach just with DevOps in general, is you can't force anybody to do it. You're going to have mutiny. So I imagine the exact same thing with DevSecOps. So all right, great. Well, doing a time check, we're about 20 minutes past the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question here, which is, you know, when we're talking about cloud native environments versus on-premises or hybrid environments, the question that I have for you guys, and Vikram, maybe you can get us started on this one, is, you know, how is DevSecOps for cloud native environments different from that for on-premises or hybrid environments, or is there a difference?
Oh yeah, it's actually very different, and the way if you look at all the spectrum of things that somebody can do today, cloud native environments could be public clouds like AWS, Amazon, and GCP. They could also be Kubernetes running on your VMware infrastructure, on your on-prem infrastructure somewhere. So fundamentally, like I think, and they both can actually host containers or not. Could be native apps. So in general, like what we find is that in a cloud native environments typically a lot more dynamic and a lot more ephemeral, and they have much bigger attack surface areas in terms of new APIs that got introduced that manage it, or just like networking, for example, becomes more opaque because the IPs, there's no correlation between IP and an application. So I think in general, when we think about on-prem and cloud native, we need to really kind of keep in mind that the scope of the technology itself is so big that the new attack vectors and the way things can get exposed really is very different between that and the on-prem environments that were being run like just a decade back.
Excellent. Okay. Anybody else want to add on to that?
One thing I would say is that I think what cloud has done in general is that because it's abstracted away some of the the hardware layers and kind of the deeper infrastructure layers, it already in general makes things a lot easier because you have standardized APIs, you have standardized ways of connecting into things, and I think that's been really positive for security, right? Because like a lot of the legacy security monitoring tools will be all about, I have to convert this data source to this, or I have to interpret this data source, and it's a lot about what I've heard somebody call data wrangling, where you're trying to get data into the right format, and you're not actually doing security, you're doing data wrangling. I think that the really great part of where we're at right now is because we have these standardized platforms, and we're working with companies in the cloud that are that security is top of mind for them as well. You're getting a lot more standardization, which is a good thing for everybody. So that way you can focus on actually interpreting the signals and processing the signals and analyzing them, not on trying to, force fit, square pegs into round holes and, whatever. So I think it's a really good thing in terms of security visibility, because the reality is most people coming to cloud environments don't have, nearly the depths of skill sets as the people building these standardized tools. So, over time, we went through a rough period a few years ago, but I think it's getting to a spot now where it's a good time to be, analyzing those signals, I think.
So do you think that standardization, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So it's actually to the same point, like the other thing which changes from because of all the standardization is really that the customers are no longer in general responsible for security of the cloud, right? Like it kind of got taken care by the public cloud providers themselves, and they have to worry about what happens inside the cloud in terms of what they run on the cloud. But an on-prem solution, a lot of the security was actually geared towards security of the infrastructure in terms of like firewalls, or in terms of a definition of a perimeter. And a lot of those techniques actually don't really work on the cloud native environment. So I think it's really very different when it comes to security.
Okay. So I was going to ask, do you think that the standardization has actually kind of made DevSecOps a little bit more, I don't want to say easier, but has it made it more malleable or maybe palatable for companies to think about adopting? Anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that you you inherit a lot of best practice, right? I think, and to the point that was made earlier about a standardized platform is the cloud providers are able to, learn lessons from, from the industry in a wider space, and then, pull those lessons back into the platform. I think that from a security perspective, cloud platforms, that's a major advantage that they offer. You inheriting those best practices. I think to the point about the shared security model, I think one of the challenges there is people don't necessarily understand, what's their responsibility and what is the responsibility of the cloud provider. So I think, that boundary is still, in my mind, is still a little bit blurred. I think that's something that people need to be quite mindful of. You can't just put your stuff in the cloud and then hope that your cloud provider is going to look after it for you. You still have a responsibility, particularly further up the stack you get towards the application.
Yeah, we could do a whole webinar on that. I think because that's definitely a hot topic. But yeah, you make some good points. Thanks, Colin. Shuri, do you think that because we are moving more toward a cloud native environment or cloud native world, so to speak, do you think that that will actually kind of spur greater adoption of DevSecOps?
I think it will, because eventually, first thing is that the cloud providers also give us some great tools for DevOps in general, but also for DevSecOps. So as you automate and you make sure that everything is, in terms of the build and the CI/CD, everything is automated, you have to make sure that the security is automated as well, right? So one of the key things here, I think, would be to have security by design. And this is very relevant for organizations that are shifting from on-premises or from hybrid into cloud or cloud native. Because you have to rethink about the security aspects inside your organizations. And typically organizations would move to DevSecOps. It's like a trigger for them to move faster to DevSecOps, in my opinion.
Okay, great. So Vikram, since you started this conversation and you said that cloud native is completely different from on-premises, that the doing DevSecOps are just two completely different animals. So maybe you can kind of walk us through some of the considerations then that organizations need to think about when they're considering doing DevSecOps in cloud native environments.
Yeah. So I think the very first thing for cloud native environments is really to kind of understand the shared responsibility model, and then kind of not focus on what the the cloud provider is already doing, but rather focus more on what the customer is supposed to do. I think according to Gartner, right, like 98% of the attacks by or the security issues by 2022 are likely to be issues where the customer made a mistake. So I think it's really important for organizations to understand what are they responsible for, and then go one by one and make sure that they kind of those things are taken care of, either in the DevOps itself, or shift left in DevOps process where they are doing the right things like vulnerability management and locking down the security groups and making sure the resources are correctly done, to the point where they deploy actually tools in the running environment in production to make sure that they are able to do intrusion detection and compliance needs of FIM type or just API monitoring on what API calls are happening. So I think in general, like for an organization to consider the whole scope of their surface area in terms of what cloud providers they use, what technologies they use. Do they use serverless? Do they use like Fargate, or they use like functions? And then kind of go through that and then understand like what kind of tools they need to make sure that they're protecting all those environments.
Okay, great. Anybody else have any thoughts there regarding some of the considerations?
One thing that brings to mind when even the way we phrased a question here is even saying cloud native. I think it to some extent when you look at customers moving to the cloud, and we particularly have a lot of customers that are, you know, across the spectrum in terms of cloud maturity. There's a big difference also between this lift and shifting your traditional architecture versus microservices. So I think, you know, to Vikram's point, like it's not like security vulnerabilities go away when you move them to the cloud. They change, they morph. But if you've got a security vulnerability in some platform you're running on premise and you just lift and shift it to the cloud, it doesn't go away. And so you do have to think about that. And then there's the, you know, the thing when you shift to microservices, which a lot of, you know, enterprises is going to do, particularly for their, you know, revenue generating apps. They have to educate them on these new models, because when you move to containerized services, you move to serverless, you know, whatever new architectures you're adopting, it looks different and it functions different. So I think keeping that in mind as you do that is really, really important. And I think in particular, one of the best ways I've heard this described is, you know, I heard somebody say, you know, in the past you had hard shells and soft centers. From a security perspective, that just doesn't fly anymore. Like you know, you have to have, you know, I don't know, hard everywhere, but you have to have everything secure. So I think there's a certain extent it's much more comprehensive. You can't just think of the perimeter because that's a different concept in the cloud. So I think a lot of this, you know, back to you know, says what Vikram was saying. I think it's a change in how you think. You have to educate yourselves. You have to make the security professionals understand the environments that they're now having to think about, and you can't just take this older hard shell soft center approach. You need to really rethink how you do things.
I think
yeah,
you're go ahead.
Yeah, I think to that point, not only are the boundaries changing, but of course everything now is the lifetimes are different, right? Everything is now ephemeral or virtually ephemeral. It makes the security, you know, any post-mortem or diagnosis makes it that much harder, right? Because the thing that was just exploited is no longer there. So there's you know, there's a time dimension to this as well that makes it that much harder.
That's a really good point. So, yeah, and it's also, Ben, what you said about the fact that, you know, these security vulnerabilities don't go away when you basically change your infrastructure. I think that's an important point too. Also, I think that, you know, maybe it's a matter of kind of getting your house in order, so to speak, and just realizing that, you know, the security, it may be different, but it's still very necessary, and basic security practices still need to be met and practiced, you know, no matter what environment you're in. So, okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next one. And so moving from the, you know, the considerations, let's talk some best practices here. Cherie, what do you think are kind of, you know, maybe your top best practices for doing DevSecOps in a cloud native environment?
Yeah, so I think that the great thing that with DevSecOps, the sprints or the parts of the work can be actually based on the security needs. So what you have to do is you actually have to break down all the things that you have to take care of. If we speak about identity, access management, the logs, monitoring, incident report, infrastructure security, which is another important thing, and basically also securing, you know, your continuous integration. You have to take everything into, you know, just your task list and make sure that you break everything into the smallest tasks. So if we take, for example, securing the CI/CD processes, so things like breaking builds based on or failing builds based on known security vulnerabilities that are out there would be a great start, right? Because we already have the process of CI/CD in DevOps. We're already testing for security vulnerabilities and making sure to fail a build if something goes wrong. So this is a great, you know, sort of easy, quick win point to actually integrate the continuous security into the CI/CD. Tools that you can very quickly give to the developers in order to secure the actual coding within the IDE. So we're speaking about like small tools that will actually not slow down everything within the software lifecycle process, but will actually enhance a lot the security aspect. And another important point here, of course, for securing the pipeline would be automation. So we know that within DevOps, automation is key, and it's exactly the same thing in DevSecOps. So everything that can be automated should be automated. So if we're speaking about builds, so sending all kinds of reports to the development, stopping builds, having some sort of validation to make sure that nothing goes wrong, logging across the entire environment, authentication and validation for the repositories. So everything that really interacts with the software lifecycle, if we break it into pieces, can be a great part to actually get started with as a best practice.
All right, those are some good tips. Anybody else have any others that Shuri might not have mentioned?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah. So one of the things
for me, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll be quick. So one of the things that I see normally happening is people roles and responsibilities. People tend to have, they get the cloud platform, they get a root login, and then they start setting people up, and they don't really manage their identity and access management. And one of the best practices would be really to fine grain that, to give people, principle of least privilege. It's pretty basic stuff, but I think in cloud with its distributed nature, I think that becomes much more important.
Excellent. All right.
Yeah. I think for me, if you kind of consider what is the primary responsibility for DevSecOps, I would kind of put it as, securing the production environment, right? Because that's where, the money-making applications are running, and the DevSecOps team is trying to make sure that it doesn't get compromised or the data is not kind of leaked out of the environment. I think if you kind of start from there, you find that some of the best practices have to be around like being able to have visibility into the environment, being able to understand what's really going on at scale. Like if you have 10,000 VMs and you have 100,000 containers that go in and out, and you do millions of processes and connections, then what is really going on in that environment? And then from that visibility, be able to do intrusion detection, being able to understand when things are not really working correctly and there's anomalous behavior going on. So then those are where you kind of want to make sure you have things in place, and then work backwards from there to be able to get into let's say vulnerability management, and being able to find things as early as possible, being able to ensure that if you have resources that are configured in a certain way, they're not misconfigured, and you're being actually proactive about checking them out. So I think eventually it turns out to be production environment that you care about, and being able to automate and integrate into a single glass is nice, but at the end of the day, DevOps is really moving fast, and new technologies get adopted really fast. They, like in a year from now, it's not clear to me, how the workload shifts, right? Security has to kind of work at the same pace and be able to keep abreast with new stuff that gets used by DevOps and is as secure as fast as it gets used.
All right, great. Ben,
one thing I would add, just to kind of tie a bow on it, is I think with what Shiri was saying is that a lot of this is about integrating into that pipeline in the way they do things, and I think it's really instructive to look at what happened with DevOps and QA. We went through this at Sumo Logic when I was a product manager and thinking about how we wanted to handle this, and what you saw is that one of the biggest problems from an operational perspective is that, it was great that you're automating everything, but then we have these, bugs that remain undiscovered in pre-production. They're very expensive to fix in production, and you're hurting the quality for your customers. And I think it's very similar with security. And if you look at what happened, this transition from QA to quality engineering is this transition away from having this separate QA team that was stood off to the side. They tested everything separately. Developers would just kind of shove things over a wall and give it to the QA team. And what was happening is it wasn't really working. So you saw a lot of these things like integrated testing and also the QE, these quality engineering teams emerging as like they were monitoring both pre-production and production. And I think that's one of the key things I would make, is that you can actually protect production by observing pre-production, right? So one of the ways that you can reduce the number of bugs that are making it into production is by doing a better job of quality engineering and integrated testing in pre-production. So if you do the same thing with security, and you have these tools, you have these processes inserted in pre-production, you by extension are going to help a lot with production. I think the difference with security is you've got a lot of other things like threats and things that you don't have with bugs, obviously. But I think a lot of this is about thinking about how you integrate into that process without stopping it ever. And it's right back to what we were talking about before with culture.
All right, great. Great. Well, doing a quick time check, we're about 20 minutes to the top of the hour. We have one other topic I'd like to go over before we go into Q&A. So I just want to do a quick reminder to the audience. If you have a question, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel. We've gotten some good questions in so far, and I'm looking forward to our Q&A section. But we still have plenty of time for lots of questions. So please feel free to submit your question at any time. Okay, our last topic before we get into the Q&A is continuing on that best practices theme. Containers. Colin, you brought up a really good point earlier that containers are ephemeral in nature. That it's kind of a moving target. So, what are some of the best practices that you can think of when we're talking about DevSecOps as it pertains to containers?
Sure. So I'd mentioned earlier that the security professionals have quite a lot on their plates. And if I think of my peers, containers and container technology and best practice is one of these things that tends to get them to panic. They're quite hard to understand, in principle, what a container is actually doing. They do look a bit like magic from the outside. The good news is I think that there's a couple of recipes. It's a technology that if you apply a couple of guidelines and recipes, you can go a long way to getting yourself secure. I think AppSec has got some really horrible issues. If you think about complex business logic flaws with time and state, these things are very hard to remove from your apps. But containers, I think, there's a pretty standard approach to this. So there's two real domains here. So one is think about how your containers are built. So consider what you're putting into your container. Veracode obviously has container analysis that can look at how your image is stacked up. WhiteSource obviously have a similar product. This is important. Put only things that you trust into that. Secure your pipeline. Pull your Docker images from a trusted registry, somewhere that you can trust. It's the same problems that you have with using vulnerable components in your app. And there was a vulnerability just recently on Docker where their registry was compromised. So that's building up your container. And then obviously the other part of the puzzle is running your container runtime. Make sure that, you, again, principle of least privilege. Don't elevate your privileges. There's some excellent guidelines. There's a CIS benchmark on best practice for containers. It's like a recipe book of how to do this. And NIST also published a guideline where there's a lot of body of knowledge that the community has collected that really tell you how to do this. So I don't think it's the challenge perhaps that people make it out to be.
All right. Well, that's good to hear. Shri or Vikram or Ben, do you guys have any other tips for using containers in the DevSecOps process?
So I think we need to, containers are really have their own software stack and kind of gives the power back to DevOps in terms of what they want to put on it, and something that you can't, makes it much easier, but makes it much harder to actually standardize across all containers, because if I need Java some version, I'm allowed to use that versus some other developer who might need some other version of Java. So I think that goes back to culture again, being able to understand what is in the images, being able to do vulnerability management for those containers, because doing it on the OS image is no longer sufficient, because a lot of your code is actually running inside containers. Having visibility into how those containers are really actually behaving in production and historically and at this time, and then being able to understand that behavior to use that for threat detection I think they're all kind of part of the whole cycle of using containers, which brings up its own security concerns.
Great, thanks. Anybody else before we move on?
Well, I'd say one thing overall that we've seen in containerization in general, and I would agree with Colin that there's a tendency to view it as something new, and then your head explodes. And at the end of the day, it's like a lot of the same. We're still solving the same fundamental problems about uptime and security, and I don't think that fundamentally changes. I think one of the harder things about containerized environments is that because they are ephemeral, meaning that stuff doesn't last very long, you can't, the tendency in the past is to be very hardware focused. It's like, what is my server doing? What is my network device doing? What is this switch doing? Whatever. And I think when you move to cloud in general, and particularly when you move to containerization microservices, you have to move up a couple levels. And you have to say, okay, have I organized my data? That's all the streams of data coming off of this stuff. Have I organized it in such a way? Do I have the metadata, basically the labeling that's going to enable me to interpret it? Because I think the real risk is swimming in so much data and so many signals that you miss the important ones. And so those events that you should be looking for, like pulling a container from the wrong image, or seeing these incoming threats, whatever it is, like it's much harder to peel that apart, I think, in a microservices environment in general, and particularly containers. So I think a lot of it is, particularly as you're developing this and you're in a development process, pay attention to data quality and data labeling, and make sure that you can actually peel these things apart. Because if you put that effort in early and you make sure that you have that stuff in place, then it makes everything later on easier. And I think this is, again, where the lines just blur between DevOps and now security, because this is something they have to do together. You can't have siloed approaches to this. You need to think about the data in its entirety and think about all the use cases, and then make sure that you have all those covered.
Excellent. All right, great. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and move on to the question and answer part of today's presentation. And like I said before, got some really great questions in so far, but there is time, guys. If you have a question, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. Our first question here is, right now in DevOps, we have multiple DevOps tools. Each and every tool has its own security. So how does DevSecOps different, or how is it different from the DevOps tool security? Ben, you want to take that one?
Sure, I can start off. I think it seems like maybe I misunderstand the question, but I mean, we have to differentiate, and it's a good question if I'm understanding it right. Well, it's a good question anyway. Is that you have to separate out tool security from the actual application security. And so I think particularly in the case of DevOps in general and DevSecOps, these things blur into each other because everything is kind of a continuous engine running. So I think you're absolutely right. In the DevOps environment, the same people who are worrying about automating things into production, the DevOps team, the site reliability team, they're worrying about the uptime of the tools that are driving that. Absolutely, in DevSecOps now, your perimeter includes the actual tool sets being used, because Colin was just saying it before. I mean, one of the weakest entry points of entry is in the tools that you're using to deploy your containers, that are using to manage your container. So again, it does require a different viewpoint, but I think this is exactly why viewing DevSecOps in particular as a continuation of DevOps, and also like breaking down these data silos, is so important, because it is all about taking a step back, looking at what's going on, and making sure that you have coverage and you understand, you have visibility into everything that's going on. So at the end of the day, no customer cares that you had a breach because someone forgot to secure Jenkins or the container repository. They don't care. They just care that you lost my data. So you have to take you have to break out of the silos, take off the blinders, and think about it holistically and cross-functionally.
Well, I think also this question kind of does bring up the point that there is still confusion in the marketplace as to really what DevSecOps is all about, and whether it's a it's a philosophy or if it's an actual like locking down the tools that are used in the DevOps process. And so I think it's a valid question in helping point out the fact that there are still maybe with a lot of people there are more questions than answers when it comes to DevSecOps. Okay, our next question, let's see. Static or dynamic scanning or both? How much time should we allow for static scanning on a given check-in before making it an offline process?
So I'll pick this up. This is right in my wheelhouse.
Awesome.
There's a bunch of different strategies that you can do here. I mean, the main pushback that people get, that I get when we're talking about fast or DAST in a pipeline is, it takes too long, right? And that's the nature of the nature of the beast. It does take a finite amount of time. There's a couple of strategies you can do. You can have a dedicated pipeline, right? So you fire away and you run the scan and you let that complete. And then if you get any findings on that, then you work out how to pull that back and how to remediate. You can do things like you can time box your scans, so you can actually set up your scanner so that it'll scan for 5 minutes, half an hour, whatever you want to do. And then if you get any findings in that time, you can get incremental results that will give you some first warning signs. And then you can choose to, at that point, if you haven't hit any findings, you can then just push through and go to release. So there's a lot of strategies, and I'd encourage people not to become too fixated on trying to find the one perfect strategy. It'll depend. It depends on your apps. It depends on the tools you use, and then obviously the defense and depth. The more types of testing that you're doing, the better your overall coverage is going to get. So think about using a mix of the two technologies.
Great. Anybody else want to chime in on that one?
No, just to add that I think there is no other choice than to combine both or more than one security tool or option, right? Because static analysis will usually inspect the code before the actual deployment, whereas the dynamic analysis is more related to runtime execution. So sort of like the friction between shifting left to shifting right. And I think that the current approach is that we have to do both, right? We have to do the static analysis in the IDE, in the repository, but we also have to do the runtime analysis after we already ship the product.
Okay, great. Okay, let's move on to our next question here. With the new package registries like GitHub's, do you think security is better versus first-party registries like Docker Hub or Node NPM? Who wants to take this one? Oh, come on, somebody's got to take this one.
Yeah, I'll have a go at that. I mean, I think it's a case of the more information sources and the more points of data and data reference that you have, the better. Let's just say, for instance, GitHub is probably going to be more ubiquitous because people can be running lots of different tool stacks and packaging tools on GitHub. Whereas if you're relying on something specific, I know Node's got a security project, and then it's only going to work if you happen to use the Node tech stack. So I just, again, it sounds like a cliche, but the wider coverage and the more ubiquitous you can get that coverage, the better.
All right, great. Sheree, did you want to add on to that at all?
No, I definitely agree. I think more and more registries or the GitHub, but also Docker Hub are trying to secure their own repositories. So for example, we can see GitHub security check, Docker Hub also have their own security check, but at the end of the day, you have to set your own measures for security and then check whether the provider actually has that ability to secure according to your policies. So I think this is very important.
Okay, great. Okay, we're about 6 minutes to the top of the hour, so I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions here. Next question. I heard Git and Docker have some security breaches, hacks, and vulnerabilities. So how come DevSecOps will resolve these in the first place?
I'll open that. You're always going to have vulnerabilities, right? There's always going to be mistakes are going to get made, things are going to creep through, mistakes happen. I think the issue is trying to identify these as quickly as possible, and then to have a recovery plan, and then obviously to have a response. Thinking the Docker that runs the vulnerability, right? That was made public. The defense and compensating measures were pretty well published. There's got a lot of visibility. So I think keep the disclosures, get the disclosures out there, get the information out there, let people recover and take remedial action. The benefits of obviously DevSecOps is it's probably only a couple of hours before you get a new release or a patch of that version, rather than having to wait until the next quarter the release comes out. I don't think you can prevent these types of things happening, but it will get better in the long run.
Excellent. Okay, anybody have anything they'd like to add to that? Okay, all right, so let's see. I think our last question here is let's see, I'm not sure. Okay, how does Nexus type of tools, how do they come in when we're dealing with images?
So I can take that. I guess the question is, how do we secure the image registries or the artifact or binary registries? So we can name some like Nexus Artifactory, maybe Azure Container Registry or Amazon Container Registry. And it's really important. I think we already discussed the idea of a secure registry or a secure source. And it's very important to make sure that you only take your artifacts or your images from either a private registry or one that has been validated for security. Another great tip would be to actually sign the images before implementing them to Kubernetes or to ECS. So basically, it's very important, and there are a lot of tools to actually integrate the security into the registry as well.
All right, great. Anybody have anything they'd like to add on to that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing like Nexus allows you the benefit of having a cached repository, right? So you can control, and I've worked in environments where the organizations really wanted to lock down what developers can access. So what they can do is they can pull known good images off the internet and then put these in your private Nexus repo, and then only allow access to that. So it just gives you that extra level of control if that's what you desire.
All right, great. Well, we are about 2 minutes to the top of the hour, so that is all the time that we have for questions. We had some good ones, so thank you very much to everybody who did submit questions. Lots of great questions, lots of great responses. Also want to thank our panelists today, Colin, Cherie, Vikram, and Ben, for taking the time out and being such awesome panelists with awesome information. So thank you all for taking the time and joining me today. Just a quick reminder that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of today's presentation, or if you just want to listen to it again, that's cool. We love that. You will have the opportunity to do so. After today's event, we are going to be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And at the same time, we are going to be sending out a link to download today's ebook that we discussed at the top of the webinar. So take a look in your email for that sometime this afternoon. Also want to remind the audience that today's event, in addition to being recorded and available via download, it's going to be living on the Security Boulevard website. So you can always find it there. Just go to securityboulevard.com/webinars, and it should be right there in the on-demand section. Again, thank you everybody for joining me today, and I hope you join us for a future webinar. Thanks again to our panelists and for the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.